but a necessary being is something that can't not exist and is actually the explanation for everything that does exist. And like I said, there's only one good candidate for that. All rise, ladies and gentlemen. It's Abdu Murray, and I'm here with another episode of All Rise, a podcast and a YouTube show where we take a look at objections against and arguments in favor of the Christian faith from a legal perspective. We want to test those things by the strictures and the rules of evidence, whether those things would be admissible in court or at least have some modicum of admissibility, and whether they have the credibility that would be necessary to send the case to the jury, as it were. And the reality is, you're the jury. I'm not the jury. You're the jury. I simply am a host here who's trying to facilitate. Now, I come from a Christian background, but I try to facilitate questions about whether or not certain objections against the Christian faith or arguments in favor of it actually do withstand scrutiny. And once in a while, you'll hear me present an objection against the Christian faith that I think should be sustained, not because the Christian faith is itself objectionable, but because a particular argument that sometimes Christians use will not be a good one. And we'll have some of those in episodes to come. In fact, we've already had a few. But we'll look at objections against the Christian faith and claims in favor and say, do these hold water? And it's my firm conviction now, having done this for quite some time, that taking my trial lawyer training into account and the way, in fact, the evidence actually does work and how evidence is marshaled and to make the case that the Christian faith really does hold up to the objections that are against it. So we're going to look at a claim by an atheist, a very famous atheist, about the Christian faith, or at least about belief in God in general, as objectionable, and why he thinks that invoking God as the designer of the universe doesn't actually get you past the problems of the alleged incoherency of belief in God. And that atheist is none other than the famous Richard Dawkins, the author of The God Delusion, The Blind Watchmaker, and many other books where he takes issue with not only the Christian faith in specific, but belief in God in general. Now, Richard Dawkins is a bona fide, actual, real scholar in his field. He is a zoologist, a biologist, and a scientist of quite a impressive rank. He's a professor at Oxford University, and so is quite a smart man and quite the guy to have to contend with. Now, he is a very famous atheist. Some of his arguments have fallen out of favor, even within the atheist community, because a lot of them have seen that some of them don't really carry the day, as it were, but he still enjoys quite a bit of notoriety and respect. So now, we're going to enter into a series, maybe one or two in a row here, but occasionally you'll hear this objection I'm going to raise during the course of certain episodes of All Rise. And once in a while, we'll do this. And we're going to do this one for this episode and for the next episode, where we're going to base our objection on the claim against the Christian faith on an objection called asked and answered. So in the legal realm, whenever a lawyer, this happens all the time, by the way, lawyers will sometimes ask a question of a witness, whether in a deposition or at actual trial. Well, they'll ask a question, and that question will not yield the answer the lawyer was hoping for. That happens all the time. Oftentimes, the lawyer would love for the witnesses to just fall all over themselves, admitting that they were wrong and that the case is actually in his client's favor and all that stuff. It almost never happens, but there you have it. Now, sometimes witnesses can be a little bit cagey or a little bit less than forthcoming. Not all the time, but sometimes. And a lawyer gets frustrated and will ask a question. And then they'll ask the same question, maybe in the exact same way a little while later, because they didn't like the first answer. Sometimes they'll reshape the question and they'll reframe it so that it's slightly different or vastly different in the framing of the question, but it's actually getting at the same kind of information. Now, sometimes that's a valid way to test whether someone is actually being honest, forthright, or consistent. But oftentimes, it's just a way for a lawyer who's frustrated, or maybe otherwise, maybe a little more on the manipulative side, to try to get a witness to answer the way they want. In other words, if you badger them enough, they'll give you what you want because you don't like the answer they gave originally. So the other lawyer on the other side, or the lawyer for the witness, might say, objection asked and answered. You've already asked that question and they've already answered it. Just because you don't like it doesn't mean you get to keep asking the same question over and over again. And oftentimes, if it's technically an asked and answered question, the judge will sustain it. Now, once in a while, the judge doesn't sustain the objection because the judge is actually interested because maybe the first answer wasn't quite believable or consistent. And then the question's asked again, and the witness maybe gives an inconsistent response. And now the judge is like, no, I want to know something more. You got to delve deeper into this. And that's perfectly understandable as well. But oftentimes asked and answered is a sustained objection because one, you're just either making the trial take way longer than it ought to, or two, because you don't like the answer you got and you are trying to essentially badger the witness into giving you the answer you'd like. And of course, when something is asked and answered, one of the things you run the risk of as a lawyer is if you keep asking a witness the same question over and over again, a savvy witness might say, how many times do you want me to tell you this before you finally accept it? And now you look like a chump in front of the jury because you clearly are afraid of the answer. So there's plenty of reasons why you want to be careful about asking a question too many times before you get the answer you like, because it might make you look like you're actually afraid of it and you've run afoul of a valid objection, which is asked and answered. So with that in mind, we're going to do a series of videos called Asked and Answered. And the point of this is to say, when have there been questions, objections to belief in God, to theism classically, or Christian theism specifically, that have been asked over the course of the centuries or decades, or maybe even recently, and have been answered over and over again, but the objection keeps being raised, or the challenge, I should say, to the Christian faith keeps being raised as if the answer hasn't already been given. It's been given many, many times. In fact, I can't remember who said it. I think it was Malcolm Muggeridge who said that all news is just old news happening to new people. And of course, Solomon says that there's nothing new under the sun. And so many of the objections people have to the Christian faith or to theism, I should say, in general, are just old objections that have been repackaged, but they've been answered a long time ago. So there are some objections that have been asked and answered. And so we're going to object to those challenges by saying, sorry, asked and answered. But we're going to go further and actually answer the challenge as well. So here is an oldie but a goodie in one sense. It's an asked and answered objection by Richard Dawkins. Got to it eventually. I realized it took me some time, but I wanted to lay some groundwork. And it's basically this, is that when asking the question, does God exist? Richard Dawkins has in the past said, if you're positing a grand designer of the universe or a grand creator of the universe, that doesn't really solve the problem because you have to ask who designed the designer or who created the creator. And so you never actually get to who God actually is because you always have to push it back further, further, and further. That's essentially the argument. So let's hear it from the lips of Dr. Dawkins himself. And he has a slightly different version of the argument in this particular clip we're going to play, but also going to quote from you from his books about how he makes the argument himself. So here is the claim against belief in God. Does God exist? He points out that you need to explain the designer or the creator himself. Every cause needs an explanation, and he doesn't even exclude God from that. So here he is in his own words.
But if you start from quite an advanced level, bacteria, and work up to mammals and humans, we have a working theory which we know is true, which explains how you can go from great simplicity to prodigious complexity, and finally to the sort of complexity which is capable of designing things, of creating things, of working out how to do things. Well, if you are suddenly going to insert a designing machine, a creator, an intelligence at the root of the universe, you've just undermined your entire enterprise, because your entire enterprise has been to explain how you get to something complicated enough to do design.
But even if that being just set in place the laws and then stood back?
Even that, even the deistic God who sets the laws in place and withdraws, if the implication is that those laws were cunningly designed, cunningly crafted, as many people think they were, so that atoms should come into existence, so that chemistry should come into existence, so that stars should come into existence, so that nuclear reactions in stars could produce the elements, so that they'd explode and we'd get a suitable chemistry to make life, and then the origin of life and so on. If the deistic God thought all that through and set up the laws of physics, then he would have to be damn clever. He would have to be the physicist to end all physicists. I don't care if he then withdraws. He needs an explanation in his own right. And it seems to me that the noble scientific enterprise is to start from as near nothing as you can get.
Yeah.
So that's quite the response he gives, and it's a slightly more nuanced version of what he'd said in The God Delusion, where in response to the issue of does God exist, Dawkins actually asks who designed the designer, and this is what his quote is: "The designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. The whole problem we started out with was the problem of explaining statistical improbability. It is obviously no solution to postulate something even more improbable." Now, you'll notice something is that basically Dawkins is denying the idea of an uncaused first cause. Either it doesn't enter into his calculus at all, or he recognizes the possibility of an undesigned designer, but just dismisses the whole idea out of hand and says, no, we can't have that. It has to be some level of design of everything. Everything that exists has to have an explanation for its existence outside of itself. Nothing can explain itself. And so that question, he basically comes down to who made God. There's several things to be said about this. The first objection is asked and answered. That has been asked and has been answered numerous times. Now, I want to be clear about something, okay? This is important. Just because a challenge to the Christian faith or a question about the Christian faith has been asked in the past and answered doesn't make the question itself illegitimate. An asked and answered objection would do that. I don't want to go too far with this analogy. But what I want to point out is that maybe you didn't come across the answer yet. Maybe you've asked the question because you haven't actually come across a good answer, or you heard Dawkins make the objection or make the challenge, or someone other than him make the objection, and you said, that's a really good question, and you haven't gotten to the answer yet. That's okay. What I want to point out to you by raising the asked and answered objection is that it has been asked, and it has, in fact, been answered, and there's a good answer. Now, before I go on, I would be remiss if I didn't just sort of comment on the statement by Richard Dawkins in response to Brian Greene's question. It was Brian Greene's podcast. It's got quite a few views, by the way, 1.3 million views. He says, that the designer would have to be even the deistic God. And a deistic God is a God who isn't personal to us. It simply creates the laws of the universe, calculates them in such a way that things would happen, then winds up the toy and then lets it go and never interferes ever again. That's what deists might claim about God. And he's saying even that definition of God would have to have a very clever designer. And what's interesting is that Dawkins, when he says that, it sounds like he's actually making some kind of a objection that means something. That's exactly what Christians are claiming. It's exactly what theists are claiming, that the designer was clever, that the designer actually knew what he was doing when he set things into motion, whether it's a deistic God, which I don't believe in, or a theistic God who is actually personal and then therefore also involved in creation as well. So for Dawkins to make sort of a comment that elicits a response, a laughter from the audience, that this designer would have to be really clever. Right. Exactly. He would have to be very clever. Now, what Dawkins is arguing, of course, is that he says we have this process by which we know that the simplest forms become the most complex forms, and we know this to be true. He's talking about evolution, of course. And what he's talking about isn't even theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism, where God set things up in a way knowing that ultimately man would result from a theory of evolution. There are Christians who actually believe that God used evolution and actually designed evolution in such a way that man would eventually result. He's saying, no, not even that. He's saying basically in a mindless, purely naturalistic, no intentions behind it kind of evolution, we have a process which he claims is true. I'm skeptical, but he claims is quite true, that we get from simple to complex all the way so that the complexity is the designer. And he's saying, if you posit a designer who even set that into motion, you've undermined the whole process of discovery about how do you get to a species like us, like human beings that can design things. I see no reason why that should be the case. Why would that even remotely come close to actually undermining the enterprise? Now, what's interesting is that this has been asked and answered. John Lennox answered this question 7 years earlier in a debate with Richard Dawkins. Now, John Lennox, if you don't know who John Lennox is, shame on you. You should know who John Lennox is. But John Lennox is a mathematician with PhDs in mathematics, and he's debated Richard Dawkins, I think, a few times actually, and he answered the question quite well. And there's been other creative responses as well. So all indications are that despite all the answers, Dawkins still believes this argument and will make it when asked. But John Lennox points out, as others do, is that when you think about a designer behind everything, that doesn't actually destroy the scientific inquiry. That in no way inhibits the ability for anyone, secular, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, you name it, to actually engage in the scientific endeavor. In fact, one would say it actually encourages it. I would argue that, by the way, as well, is that just because there seems to be, and there's an episode of the podcast where I sit down with Scott Symington and talk to him about science and these kind of things. There's a reality where just because there's a designer doesn't mean that you stop searching for how we as designers came about. You don't suddenly look at a Rembrandt and say, oh, Rembrandt created that, so now I'm not going to study Rembrandt's techniques anymore, or I'm not going to study art history or art theory anymore. I'm not going to study color theory or composition or anything. In fact, my guess is that if you saw something that was designed as beautifully as a Rembrandt or a Da Vinci or a Caravaggio or whatever it might be, and you saw something so amazing, it would inspire more learning and more discovery about that subject than if you thought it was just simply random. Yes, the random might cause tons of inquiry as well, but just because it's a designer in no way undermines the endeavor at all. In fact, it might inspire awe to find that out. In fact, I'm not sure he actually said it, but Francis Bacon was attributed to having said, as a scientist, oh God, as I study your world, I find myself thinking your thoughts after you. That's interesting all by itself. So no, positing an uncaused and an undesigned designer doesn't end the inquiry. It doesn't undermine the enterprise. In fact, I would argue that it infuses the enterprise with far more awe and rigor and wonder to find yourself chasing after the very mind of God. What could be more scientific? What could be more inspiring? Having said that, let's get to the actual objection itself. So it's fascinating for two reasons. This objection that, who designed the designer or who caused the first cause? In a sense, it's special pleading, because you notice something. He appealed to evolution in the clip. He appeals to evolution as a process that we supposedly know is true, and truly explains how we went from simple to complex. We went from simple organisms to complex organisms that are capable themselves of designing. So the system works in such a way through natural selection and random mutation that we go from simple organisms to increasingly complex organisms, and those organisms start to have biodiversity and all these various things. And we have us at the pinnacle of this whole entire endeavor. The reason why this is a bit of a special pleading is that physics tells us, the laws of physics, and any scientist will tell you this, that the laws of physics tell us that everything is actually decaying. We're not going from disorder to order. We're going from order to disorder. Here's how I know that. Your computer, whatever it is you're listening to this show on, whether it's your phone or a computer or something else, keep using it. Just keep using it for a while. It's going to degrade. There's going to be glitches. You're going to have to get a new one at some point. Every chair you've ever sat in at some point needs to either get fixed, repaired, or replaced. The world your body is not getting better and better and better all the time after a certain age. Actually, we do get stronger, faster, more flexible, and whatever over a certain amount of time. But once you reach a certain age, your cells stop dividing. They stop producing certain things. Now certain things can invade in them. And if you don't keep it up through exercise, diet, and supplements, you're going to actually decay. And if you do all that stuff anyway, if the laws of nature have anything to do with it, your body will begin to sag, gravity will take its toll, you're not getting better. Our bodies are getting worse over time, which is why we have maintenance. This is why we have wrinkle creams and anti-aging and all that stuff, because we need an outside force to prevent things from going from order to disorder, from function to non-function, from strength to weakness. That's called entropy, is that things at some level are organized and they end up becoming disorganized over time. That's just in a closed system. That's just the way it works. Somehow, evolution goes against that. It's a law of physics. It's the way the world works. But evolution says, no, we go from disorder to order. It goes against the entropic stream. For some reason, this does that. Now, maybe there's a good explanation of it, and I've heard some explanations, and fine, but evolution seems to go against the entropic stream. So he's talking about this whole idea of we go from simple to designed, and we get to this complexity from simple to complex, to the point where we get a designer out of it, meaning us. But to start with a designer, to get to a designer, simply doesn't make any sense. But the whole theory he's going on goes exactly against the entropic stream of the way physics works. So that's fascinating all by itself. But further, there's another issue here, is that he's trapped himself in an infinite regress. And so he denies the supernatural, and so he's unable to answer this question. How do you avoid an infinite regress? And again, I've already talked about this in a previous episode when I had Scott Symington on the show. We talked about the possibility of the universe being eternal, or there being an internal inflationary model where the universe expands and contracts ad infinitum, or there's a number of infinite numbers of multiverses, whatever it might be. And go back and watch that episode. I encourage you. But what he is suggesting is philosophically problematic. And so this runs afoul of the whole idea of just because you're an expert in one area doesn't mean you're an expert in all areas or another area. And this falls into the realm of philosophy. Now, Richard Dawkins admittedly would not say he's a philosopher. By the way, you don't have to be a philosopher to philosophize. It's okay. I'm not a professional philosopher. I have no PhD in philosophy. Yet I've read quite a bit, and so I can make an opinion, but take it as far as it goes. Take my opinion as far as it might go. Take Dawkins' opinion as far as it might go, and anybody else for that matter. But what he's done is actually engaged in relatively poor philosophy, because every time you have to ask the question, who designed the designer, or who created the creator? Okay, then you give an explanation. Well, who created that creator? Okay, give an explanation. Well, who created the creator of that creator? You're going to have an infinite regress back, which means you're going to have an infinite number of things going back in the past. And that simply won't do, because we are here. You're watching this or listening to this in the present moment now. And if there's an infinite regress of actual events of creation and causation and all this stuff, you could never actually get to now, because you can never count backwards far enough to start the count. It just doesn't work. And so you can't have an actual infinite regress of anything. But by Dawkins' logic, you'd have to have an actual infinite regress of anything. So let's take God out of it. Let's say, okay, here I am, full of organic material. Carbon and other things have created Abdu Murray, the living human male Abdu Murray. And my explanation is my parents. And their explanation is their parents. And it begins to branch out into the family tree, sort of going backwards, where it gets more and more people back in time. But human beings have their origins in a sort of a pre-humanoid hominid form, and those share a common ancestor with chimps, and then those share a common ancestor with something else, and then those share a common ancestor down, all the way to you get to single-celled organisms, and even organic material where you get DNA, and even that has its genesis in something else before it, which was inorganic matter. And then even that has its genesis in stars, which had nuclear reactions, as Dawkins pointed out. And even those stars had a prior cause, which was various of the coalescing of gravitational or the use of gravitational forces to basically coalesce certain elements together. So you get the nuclear reactions in the first place, and those are based on the laws of physics. But all that goes back to a singularity called the Big Bang, when there was actually nothing before that. And so you get to, you get to the initial thing. But you have to ask the question, what caused the Big Bang? And if you don't have an actual explanation, you've run into the same exact objection on the physical realm that Dawkins raises of the supernatural realm. you have to have a stopping point. There has to be a stopping point because we're here. And you have to have a stopping point in the past where the thing that caused everything is itself uncaused, or it explains itself in its own existence. That's what a necessary being actually is. So when he says things like, you have to insert something in there, no, you're not inserting anything in there. You're not inserting a designer as if it was an ad hoc insertion into the whole enterprise. You're not doing that. You're actually saying, I'm trying to explain how things are here. And the only way to actually logically do that and not be run afoul of an infinite number of regresses where you can never get to now because you're always going back in the past infinitely is you have to posit something like an uncaused cause, or a undesigned designer of everything. You have to get there at some point. It has to stop. And I think that God is a great explanation of what an uncaused cause and an undesigned designer actually would be. And there's a number of reasons. And again, you can go back and watch the episode I did with Scott Symington, where you actually have to have a God who is, one, effectual, not effete, like abstract numbers. Like the number one doesn't do anything. Even if it does exist eternally and necessarily, it doesn't do anything. One doesn't cause things. The idea of harmony doesn't cause anything. It's just an idea. It doesn't do stuff. But a personal agent does. So you have to have an uncaused personal agent to actually cause something, or at least have some level of causative force. Second, the reason why I do believe it's personal is because this universe, this life-permitting universe, could have been very, very different. And so it looks like choices were actually made. So if you have to stop the infinite regress so it's finite, at an uncaused cause, and you have all these appearances of design in the universe, that choices were actually made, the more likely, not improbable as Dawkins would have it, but the most probable explanation of why everything is here is that there was an uncaused cause, or there is an uncaused cause that made choices about the rest of reality and grounds that reality. That is God. That is the very definition of a necessary being. So in the moments we have remaining, I think it's important to address this issue and say that saying who caused God or who is the God of God or what created God proceeds from a faulty assumption of what classical theism, and I would say even Christian theism, actually posits. And I would suggest, by the way, a book by David Bentley Hart called The Experience of God, where he actually talks about this whole idea of God being the necessary being in a very, very powerful way, responds to Dawkins and others as well. If you're looking for a further treatment on this, I would highly recommend that book. But this proceeds from a very faulty understanding, almost, and please forgive the term, because I don't want to make it sound pejorative, but it almost comes from a childish understanding of God, almost like the gods of the ancient Greeks or the Babylonians or the various pagans who believed that their gods emerged from the ether, that there was this pre-existing thing that exists, and the gods and the titans emerged from an ether, and so actually owe their existence to something else that always pre-existed them. That's not a Christian conception of God at all. Christians don't believe that God emerged in any way, shape, or form, but that God is the center of, the grounding of all existence. He is the source of all existence. He is a necessary being. So Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz actually posited this argument from contingency, where he talks about, he asks the question, why is there anything? Or why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there something? Why is there Skittles? Why are there, like my MacBook? Why is there me? Why is there air? Why are there sharks? Why are there rings on Saturn? Not like why did the rings form around Saturn, but why is there stuff at all? Why isn't there just nothing? And so the question is a valid question. Why is there something rather than nothing? And he basically comes down to this, is that all things are either contingent or necessary. A contingent thing is a thing that has to have an explanation for its existence. I'm a contingent thing. My MacBook is contingent. In other words, it doesn't explain itself. Something explains this. A group of engineers who designed MacBooks, and the software guys and the hardware guys and even the aesthetically, minded guys who design how the MacBook looks cool or whatever it might be, helped design this particular MacBook. And they also got that idea from Steve Jobs, who got that idea from somebody else before him. And so there's all these explanations for how this MacBook got here. It's contingent. It doesn't explain itself. This did not always exist, and it could have not existed. Philosophically, it's a possibility that this thing could not have existed. The universe is just like that. You can imagine a world in which the universe was smaller. It had less atoms in it, or less galaxies, or whatever. You could imagine that world. That's perfectly plausible. And it could have been smaller, or larger, or different in a billion different ways. In other words, it's contingent. It doesn't have properties that suggest that it always must have been there. It just isn't necessary. It's contingent. Even if it was eternal, by the way, it would be contingent because it has an explanation outside of itself. But something has to have an explanation within itself. And that's what's called a necessary being. So a contingent thing is something that could have not existed and must have an explanation for its own existence. A necessary thing, a necessary being, is something that could not have not existed. It's a lot of negatives, I realize that, but it must exist. It's the kind of thing that you can't imagine not existing. Now, of course, I could say I can imagine God doesn't exist, but you can't imagine non-existence. Something has to be the grounding of all existence because existence is actually real. So what explains that is a necessary being. And a necessary being, there are various candidates for necessary beings, but a necessary being is something that can't not exist and is actually the explanation for everything that does exist. And like I said, there's only one good candidate for that. And that is a personal creator that made choices about the way everything else exists. And I think that's an incredibly good definition of what God actually is. And I think the Christian faith gives you, I think, not just a competing version with other theistic traditions, and they're great. I mean, they give their explanations for a God as well. But the Christian faith actually does the best job of describing a God who is himself necessary from everlasting to everlasting. He never begins and he never ends. And he makes choices about the way things are. He hangs the stars. He is the designer of all these things. When God asks Job at the end of Job, who are you? When you ask these questions, and I don't think it's meant necessarily to put Job in his place, but it's to put Job in his proper perspective. So were you there when I did this? Were you there when I did that? When I decided these things and all these things? God is the ultimate and first designer, the uncaused cause. That is classical theism. So Dawkins' objection and objections like it don't actually start anywhere. They sound like they mean something important, but they've been asked and they've been answered. And they've been answered, I think, beautifully by the Christian faith centuries and centuries ago. So we can have tremendous confidence that God is not only the seat of all of existence, but he is a caring seat or root of all of existence because choices were made and those choices resulted in you. You are not just simply the result of a process that I was wound up by a deistic God who doesn't really care about the results, or a mindless, pitiless, blind, indifferent universe, which is what Dawkins says actually exists. You are not the product of that. You're something more than that. And that is someone who's created. And in fact, the reason why you are a designer is not because there was a mere accidental evolution of this brain that we use all the time. No, the reason you are a designer is because you are given the privilege, and I am given the privilege of reflecting God's image. And he is the ultimate designer. Is it any wonder then that when the Bible says we are made in his image, that we should reflect that divine splendor of creation and design? So the objection asked and answered, I'd say would be sustained in this particular instance, because there is wonderful reasons to believe that God is a necessary being, and he chose you, and he chose me to be here for his good purposes. So friends, until next time, I'm Abdu Murray. This has been All Rise, a podcast where we look at objections against and claims in favor of the Christian faith from a legal perspective. You're the jury, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and I rest my case for now. So the defense rests. See you soon.